Tens of thousands of protesters sweep through Brazil's largest cities. With more demonstrations expected, what's behind the discontent? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Protests of this size haven't been seen in Brazil for decades. The demonstrations began 2 weeks ago, sparked by a rise in bus fares. But as the protests have grown, so have the grievances. Many say they're fed up with government corruption and poor services, as the nation spends billions to prepare for the World Cup. A heavy-handed response from the police led to even more protests. Brazil's president issued a conciliatory statement on Tuesday, telling the protesters that their demands are being heard.
Surgiram cidadãos que querem mais.
There has been a surge in the number of citizens who want more and who have the right to more. We are facing new challenges. The people who took to the streets yesterday are asking for more citizenship, more health, better education, better transportation, more opportunities. I guarantee you that my government also wants more, and we will get more for our people and our country.
Some 40 million people have moved out of poverty into the middle class over the last decade. So how did a rising economic power create such discontent? Al Jazeera's Gabriel Elizondo has been covering the protests. He sent us this update from Sao Paulo.
What we're seeing in Brazil right now is really unprecedented in recent memory. The last time we saw anything even close to this was 1992, and that's when then President Fernando Collor faced a wave of opposition in the streets. He was later impeached. Let me show you some of the headlines here in the papers in Brazil. This is O Globo of Rio saying Brazil on the streets, photographs of the more than 100,000 people that were in Rio on Monday. This is Estado newspaper from Sao Paulo. It says protests spreading all over the country. Politicians now are the targets. And then finally, another big paper here in Sao Paulo. This is Folha newspaper, and this says thousands of people on the streets against everything, with a big photograph of some of the protesters that invaded the roof area of the National Congressional Building in Brasilia on Monday. Now, this was a protest that really started a couple weeks ago as mostly a youth movement, but what I'm starting to see in the last few days at least is a bigger cross-section of Brazilian society sort of joining in this protest movement that's really spread all over the country now. It clearly is still being fueled by the youth. They are providing really the enthusiasm at the street level for this, but we're going to have to see if this continues or if it starts to fade away or not.
Joining us from Rio de Janeiro is academic and investigative journalist Christopher Gaffney. He's the author of the book Temples of the Earthbound Gods. Here in DC, we have João Castro Neves. He's a Latin America analyst with the Eurasia Group. And we also have Dave Zirin, author of the book Game Over, How Politics Has Turned the Sports World Upside Down. He's also the sports correspondent for The Nation magazine. Professor Gaffney, since you're in Rio, perhaps you're the person I should address some of these first questions to. What is this about? I think that's what most people who aren't in Brazil are asking right now.
Right, it's about a lot of things. It's about the bus fare hikes, it's about the privatization of public space, it's about the lack of quality education, it's about the lack of public health care, it's about the upcoming events, it's the privatization of iconic public spaces like the Maracanã, the spending of billions of dollars for hosting these mega events. And it's also about things like transparency and about the fundamental structures of Brazilian democracy. And I think really what gets to the root of it is that while we have seen a lot of material improvements in Brazilian society in the last 10 years, we haven't seen any fundamental structural changes. And I think people are fed up with this because their services haven't improved as a result, and they don't feel that they have real democratic channels to express their grievances, and so now they're on the streets doing that. And
we'll develop those thoughts in a moment, but there was a poll, a remarkably quick bit of polling by Datafolha, the Datafolha Institute, a survey of the protesters on the streets. This is what they found. 84% of the protesters polled said they had no preference in political parties. 77% of them are college graduates. About 1/4 are current students. More than half of them are under the age of 25. And for 3/4 of them, Monday was the first time they'd ever taken part in a protest. The main reason those surveyed gave for taking to the streets was a more than 6% increase in the cost of public transportation. Clearly, this is all at a very early stage, and that was clearly done at a very early stage, often early stage of demonstrations. But I mean, there is that question, Professor Gaffney, as to whether then this is just a bunch of middle-class college kids who aren't necessarily representative of the rest of Brazil, who've done pretty well, actually, frankly, over the last 10 years.
Well, we have to really qualify what it means to be middle class in Brazil. The government figures include people that make over 1,000 reais a month, which is $500 a month. And so this is a qualification of what.
And I thought that might happen. We're going to see whether we can get Professor Gaffney back. João Castro Neves, though, as we try and get Professor Gaffney back, what do you make of that, though? Is this just a bunch of middle-class kids, or is this much wider and much more symbolic of deep structural problems?
Yeah, I think the second is true. I think that's a much deeper story going on here, basically. Although it started with one single movement of students or upper middle class students, I think that at the end of the day, this is a story that not only in Brazil, but leaders of other Latin American nations are also facing. Basically, the rise of a middle class that needs to be qualified, as Professor said, but also a middle class that demands more from leaders, from political leaders. Not only cash transfer programs, but quality, better public services. So it's a quality of life agenda. And the challenge for leaders today is that they have to deliver more to this rising middle class with less, given that economic environment is more unfavorable today than it was before.
Chris Gaffney, do you want to finish your thought now that we have you back?
Yeah, I agree that this is in part a quality of life agenda, but quality of life has to do with your access to rights. And it's not just about having better transportation, it's about having transparency in governance. And I think that because there are so many non-affiliated people or non-affiliated with parties, we're seeing that they don't feel represented by anybody in government. And so they're taking to the streets to express their dissatisfaction. Yes, of course, with the quality of life issues, but at the root of the quality of life issues are the lack of education, the lack of police training, the lack of transparency in government, and the lack of real structural reform that's we've seen, for instance, increases in corruption cases and unfinished mega projects throughout Brazil under the PT. And so even though this is a nominally leftist government, we haven't seen that there's been this massive redistribution of wealth and improvement in the quality of life for the average citizen.
Chris Gaffney, I mean, how has this movement, though, developed over the last few weeks, really, then, from this rebellion against the fare hikes to this broader-based protest movement? I mean, is it sort of organic? Is it being organized through any central leadership? What's going on exactly, as far as you can tell?
Well, for several years now, there has been a constant militancy in all of the World Cup cities that have been organized through the Comités Populares da Copa, the popular committees of the World Cup. And these nascent organizations have been able to reach out and reach out horizontally to bring in people to discuss social issues surrounding the World Cup and the Olympics. This movement has gone well beyond what those committees thought was possible and has been a real horizontal movement instead of a vertical movement. And that is, it's not top-down, it's based on social media, it's based on people telling their friends to come out and protest. And while it started with the youth, it's now expanding towards older people in the middle class that are dissatisfied with paying incredibly high taxes to have that money be misappropriated and ill-used for the public good.
And Dave, I mean, you've been writing for years, actually, as has Chris Gaffney and others, though, about the enormous, how the preparations for the Olympics, the Confederations Cup, the World Cup, have involved an enormous amount of repression and waste in the name of progress. In one of your articles, you had an academic, I remember, warning you of the mankini that hid the truth behind all the impressive social indicators and so forth. But I mean, what exactly did that mean?
Well, yeah, it was this gentleman who said statistics are like a mankini. They show so much, but they hide the most important parts. Mankini being a fill-in for a Speedo, a skimpy bathing suit. And the most important part that this gentleman, Marcos Alvido, was referring to was the gap. And that's the gap between people's expectations of what a wealthier Brazil with a larger middle class should be able to provide, and then what they actually experience on a day in, day out basis. And in so many ways, that's highlighted by Brazil hosting both the World Cup and the Olympics, because of course it doesn't just come in festooned with, hey, it's going to be a big party. It also comes in with the expectation and the promises that it's going to provide jobs, that it's going to provide a higher standard of living, that countries across the world are competing for this because it does provide a standard of living. And so what it is, dressed in the wrappings of sports and a big party, it's basically trickle-down economics. The idea a lot of money is going to come in and everybody is going to be able to benefit. And what Brazil is finding out, like many countries across the earth have found out, is that it doesn't really trickle down, it actually trickles up. And so these fare hikes are an example of money trickling up into the state as opposed to trickling down for people. And of course, it seems like it was the straw that broke the camel's back.
And of course, this is all connected, though, into the enormous upheaval that came with the building for the Olympics and the World Cup, Dave, which you've been writing about for many years. For example, the bulldozing of the favelas, where the poorest of society lived. I mean, do we know how many have been forcibly moved, what happened to them in the name of progress?
Yes, I mean, we are talking about thousands of people when it's all said and done. Some of them are moved into government-created housing that's very small, very ramshackle. And what's important for people to realize, and Chris has done a lot of work in trying to get people to realize this, is that favela, it's loosely translated to mean slums, but to call it slum does not in any way, shape, or form give credit to the incredible amount of impersonal investment that people put into their homes. I mean, in many cases, you're talking about generations of families who have built up these homes because Brazil has had for decades some of the strongest squatter rights laws in the world. And so a lot of fear that people have is that the Olympics and the World Cup are being used to create a state of exception in Brazil for the purposes of real estate speculation. So all of that tremendous property that people have been living on with squatters' rights all of a sudden becomes real estate to be developed.
I mean, is João Castro Neves, is that something you'd agree with, though? This trickle-down model simply hasn't worked, then, as far as the infrastructure development in Brazil for the World Cup, the Confederations Cup, and the Olympics?
Yeah, I think a lot of promises were made, actually, and now there's a growing sense of frustration where the governments, use these two events. I mean, the only country that held back-to-back World Cup and Olympics in history was the U.S. in '94, '96. So this was an example of rising Brazil, the main example of rising Brazil over the last, several years. And a lot of promises were made, and I think that now people realize that most public money went to build stadiums that are going to be used for a couple of times. And around the stadiums, there's a lacking of infrastructure. So basically now that the governments began just turning to the private sector to try to attract investments for rails, roads, ports, and airports, but too little, too late. And a lot of the public money went instead to stadiums, which are going to be used for a few games.
Do we have an accurate understanding, Dave, of how many billions have been spent on all of this?
The numbers vary. If people look online, they'll see the numbers vary. But the general trend you see is 30 to 40 billion for the Olympics, 20 to 30 billion in that area for the World Cup. And it's worth saying that it's a very different world than in the mid-'90s when the U.S. did '94 and '96 because of security concerns in a post-9/11 world, because of the research and development that has gone into the kinds of security that is now required to host one of these mega events, and because of the infrastructure that is demanded now by the IOC and FIFA for these events.
Well, that raises another point, though. One of the placards we often see is I don't want to give all my money to FIFA. I don't want to give all my money to IOC. How much money do they get out of this? And why are they getting money? Why are they getting the money? Why isn't it being used just to spend money on the infrastructure?
Why is FIFA a stateless actor in this process?
But how much of a cut do they get?
I mean, that's one of the things that's very hard to put your finger on, because FIFA is a closed body. And so it goes in, it makes its deals with the countries, it gets a cut of the corporate underwriting, it gets a cut of the infrastructure development, it gets a cut of what they say are needed for their costs to continue the promotion of soccer worldwide. And unfortunately, when it's all said and done, you could ask folks in South Africa, it feels a little bit more like a holdup than it does a celebration. In other words, you don't end up loving yourself in the morning.
Professor Gaffney, does democracy have much of a place, though, amidst these sorts of huge infrastructure and redevelopment projects that come with a successful Olympic bid or a successful World Cup bid?
Well, yes and no. I mean, part of the problem, or one of the principal problems with both the Olympics and the World Cup is that they come with these projects, as Dave was talking about, that are planned outside of the realm of democratic participation.
Right.
And so once a country signs a contract with the IOC, for example, they are obliged to deliver a series of infrastructures that are typically planned by public relations firms in conjunction with the National Olympic Committee. And so the city plan, in the case of Rio de Janeiro, has become the Olympic plan. But that Olympic plan never passed through any sort of process that could be contributed to by the citizenry. And so we're forced to pay for these infrastructure projects, the very ones that are dislocating tens of thousands of people, for projects that were made behind closed doors. And so this is part of the democratic uprising here to say, look, we don't have a say in where our money is going. We contribute some of the highest taxes in the world for some of the poorest services, and we don't even get to say what we're spending the money on.
But surely there has to be some...
This is part of what the protests are about.
There was some thought, though, of how you build this infrastructure for the long term in order to benefit the majority after the sports people have gone home. I mean, for example, transportation links are usually developed when around an Olympics and so forth, and they have built all these bus rapid transit lines and things like that. I mean, are they not going to have some, given that the origins of this particular dispute were bus fares, I mean, isn't that going to have some good effect in the long run?
Well, there are three runs we can talk about. The short run, it's forcibly removing tens of thousands of people from their homes, and that is done in a way that has been documented to violate massively the human rights of the people in Rio de Janeiro. In the medium term, it will get people to and from the Olympic events. But if you look at the map of Rio de Janeiro and you understand the geopolitical strategies of the government and where the vested interests of the mayor and the governor are, these lines are all directing development to one part of the city. In the long term, you're erecting high-speed bus lines that are cutting through dense urban fabric. And I don't see how that is going to benefit the people that live around them when you have a metro going through the wealthy part of town and a high-speed bus line that's cutting through people's neighborhoods. You really see that this is not an urbanization project, and it's not a project that's developing a wider mobility network for the metropolitan area. And so while yes, there should be infrastructure improvements, there should be a long-term urban plan, these plans are developed in the context of Brazil to attend very short-term demands of the event and very narrow political and geopolitical, by that I mean class interests of the ruling parties in both the city, the state, and at the federal level.
And it shouldn't go unnoticed. It certainly hasn't by people in Rio when I was there, that the bus rapid transit line that you described is actually called that in English, bus rapid transit.
Right. João Castro Neves, let's then link this up to the sort of demonstrations that we're seeing now on the streets, the sort of reforms that we've seen over the last 10 years, the nominally left-wing reforms that we've seen over the last 10 years, which appear to have certainly spent a great deal more money on the social needs of the people, but while fundamentally keeping the political and commercial interests of the country pretty much intact without any fundamental reform. I mean, is that basically where we're... I mean, the Olympics are the latest symptom, perhaps, of that.
Well, yes. I mean, definitely there's a more structural reason or to explain what's going on right now. And I think definitely the country benefit quite immensely from favorable winds of the global economy in the last 10 years. You know, Chinese growth, commodities boom, and Brazil basically rode that those favorable winds. And you know, and as a result, you had middle class becoming the largest class in the country for the first time in history, which is a big thing for a country as unequal as Brazil is. Now, the problem is that now for this mass of people, is more than 50% of the population that constitute the middle class, although we need to qualify exactly what we're talking about here. For them, you know, cash transfer programs, it's not enough now. I mean, more and more, that's what I meant about quality of life agenda, saying that, you know, now they don't need only cell phones. They need cell phones that actually work. So we need to go beyond just providing them with the good and providing them also the service. So that's more complicated to be, that requires more competence, that requires more long-term planning, and that's something that has been in the lacking of Brazil in recent years.
But, Professor Gaffney, I wonder, I mean, this is where perhaps some dangers lie, though, I wonder. I mean, there have been those oligarchical kind of forces in Brazil who haven't been very happy, even with this level of reform to help the poor, to move away from complete neoliberal orthodoxy to at least helping the poor a little bit. They haven't been happy about this. Are they not watching these demonstrations and thinking, hang on, this might be a good opportunity to even wipe out, you know, the vaguely left-wing impulses of this government and start talking about how, well, we need more competition, we need more free markets, we need to spend less, we need to look at inflation and things like that. This could be hijacked pretty easily, couldn't it?
I think it can and it can't. You have to understand that the political power of things like the wealth transfer programs have in Brazil, especially in places like the Northeast. Those programs have been criticized as been merely something to get votes, although that has had the relatively tremendous effect of pulling people out of situations of misery to be poor and lower middle class people. I think you could argue that, look, the left party, the PT, has taken public money and has emptied the coffers, and this hasn't worked to encourage Brazilian development. On the other side, you can look and see what they're investing their money in. And we need to perhaps reorient the investment to away from extractive economies, away from bullet trains, and into things like basic healthcare reform, basic education reform, and then to actually have systems of accountability that will encourage the fortification of Brazilian democratic institutions and not their weakening.
João Castanheira, very briefly there, what can Dilma do you think, right now, though, to head this off?
Well, I think not much, and I think, but then again, I think this is a very diffuse movement that is not targeting only Dilma. It's targeting also the local governments, which, you know, who raised the bus fares was a government led by DPT. Who the police crackdown was the responsibility of the state government is led by the opposition.
Right.
So my fear here is that this may lead to political apathy when it comes to elections next year. That people may not vote or vote in a protest vote that may elect someone from outside the political circles, which was a danger. So that's the main risk. So Dilma herself, I think that she cannot do much at this moment, but acknowledge these movements, try to at least, you know, help not to be more violence, and which is essential, and you know, try to improve the governing basically, and the economy. I think that's, you know, if the economy starts to improve, maybe the government will have more money to kind of improve services. Actually,
very briefly, Professor Gaffney, that's another issue, though, is that the police, you know, with that kind of local and federal police difference there, I mean, you can have opposition-controlled police who kind of want to stoke these things up then. I mean, that could be another issue, couldn't it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's an incredibly fluid situation right now, and you do have these competing political interests. And I think that Brazil, we still need to remember the democracy in Brazil effectively started in 1988, and the first president was impeached. And so we don't have long traditions of developing democratic institutions. And the vote is but one element in a democratic process. Taking to the streets like this is another element in a democratic process. And so even if there is a protest or zero vote in the next elections, it shouldn't just be about the vote. And I think people are starting to realize, like, hey, we really need to create mechanisms for our voice to be expressed, and we need to go directly to the sources of power. And most people don't, I think, have, they're not really talking about Dilma as much in Rio. They're talking about the governor and they're talking about the mayor, because these are the people that most directly impact their lives. And I think that these protests on the local level will eventually have repercussions, especially in the huge cities of the Southeast. They will have repercussions at the federal level in the 2014 elections. But I think for most people, what's really important is getting things straight in their backyard and taking these protests to the street and expressing their discontent at the continued corruption, the lack of public services, and especially in the case of Rio, or Sao Paulo, or Belo Horizonte, or Brasilia, as we've seen, the total lack of readiness on the part of the police to handle peaceful protests. I mean, we shouldn't have journalists getting shot in the face. We shouldn't have innocent children or anyone getting pepper sprayed, tear gassed, concussion bombs, run over by cars, thrown in jail, arbitrary violence on the part of the police. And that's what's happening every day here in Brazil. And this has helped to consolidate the movement across class lines, across generational lines, and across geographic space in Brazil. And that's why we're seeing such a huge movement right now.
Professor Christopher Gaffney, thank you very much. Dave Zirin, thank you. Joao Casio Neves, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.